Hey, welcome to this beginner art course, the series in which I break down art theory and practice into easy to digest, bite-sized chunks. I'm Erin, and you're watching episode 3, where we're talking about what to draw with. This isn't going to be a comprehensive list, but I can show you the things that I've got and maybe a touch on a few others as well. So first of all, we are going to be touching on graphite. I mean, these are just common old garden pencils. Graphite comes in a whole load of different sort of firmnesses, H for hard and B for bold. Basically, the higher the number, the more in that direction it is, and HB is in the middle. So this is one of the great things about pencils, is the variation in line weight. So you can draw very softly, very lightly, but you can also draw very bold lines. Let's say you have a circle that you're shading. Being able to come in dark and just let that come up to light. It allows you for a lot more versatility and a lot more kind of dynamism in the work that you're producing. And so the great thing about pencils is that they're dirt cheap. You can get them everywhere. You know, you get like a pack of 30 for like £4. The cons, I think, of being into using pencils, the need to sharpen. So this is something that I keep in my pencil case. It's just a little blade. I don't like pencil sharpeners. I think that so often you'll be sharpening a pencil, the pencil sharpener won't be sharp enough, and it will mess up your tip, like on this one. So the next thing I'm going to show you is something special about these pencils, is that they are watercolour pencils. I will demonstrate that a little bit later, but for now, let's just take a few out and talk about them a little bit. So the other great thing about pencils is that they come in a huge variety of colours. You can mix colouring pencils. You can layer your colours over one another, which is super important. If you are, say you're working on creating some sort of face tones, some sort of reds and pinks and browns, things like that. Let's say you got your base colour down, and then you need to add some orange to it in this particular area. You need to add some reds over here. These colours, they all layer up together. So that red on its own is quite different from the sort of the warmer patch over here where we've got the orangey yellow in there. And it's just a case of building up those layers, working out what it is that you need, and applying it. Next on the agenda is rollerballs. Just turn over, let's go blank sheet. Right. There's two types of ink that you get in rollerballs. You get ones which have quite sort of wet, runny ink, like that. And you get this one which has very kind of like a tacky sort of thing, like a Bic Biro. Sort of you have some sort of dynamic range with ballpoints. The problem with them is that you can't use them uphill because they're gravity assisted. You don't want to be using something where you can't control your line weight. And this is very easy to control your line weight. It's just a sort of a pressure thing. You know, they're waterproof, you can use them in the rain, you can draw on pretty well anything with a biro. They're dirt cheap, you don't have to carry a pencil sharpener or a knife with you. You get out your pen and you work with it. You have a whole range of colours. Different makers make lots of different coloured pens. Well, the next thing we're getting into is fibre tip pens. So I've got these uni pens. These are all various line weights. There's a difference between the two tips here. If you're doing a drawing, especially if it's a technical drawing, these pens having line weights that you choose, very handy. Very, very handy. As well as fine liners, other felt tips, these ones are super cheap. As you can see, there's a lot of different colour that you can choose from. This pack, I got 2 of every colour for £1. £1 for, I think, 50. You can get a lot better felt tips. I'm just thinking of the coloured fine liners. I can't remember who makes them. Styler? They do great coloured fine liner tips. And again, these are things that you can layer up. Very cheap, very easy to get your hands on. Fibre tips everybody knows about. Permanent markers. The problem with permanent markers is that they are, I think, an alcohol-based one. They will bleed through. They're probably not something that you're going to be using a lot. Again, you can get lots of different colours with permanent markers. So one of the difficult things about felt tips is you have some variation. You know, your lines can change weight depending on which part of the nib you're using. You don't really have a lot of control over it. But that's firm felt tips. So let's look at a medium firmness one. This is the Pentel Sign Pen, Sign Touch. Really lovely pen to work with. It has a nib that's kind of distorts. So you have this nib like this, but it's not completely rigid. So it can sort of like that. It's not a brush pen, but you can get a lot of thickness out of it by just applying more pressure. It's much more analog than with a felt tip. It's way easier to use it in a sort of more expressive, artistic way. And as well, sort of the line breaking, I really like that. So we have soft pastels, and these ones are really soft, actually. Again, this is a media that you really require some thinking about your layering. So you can put down big sheets of colour very quickly, big planes of colour, as well as having like a fair amount of sort of ability for detail. You know, you have the corner, you have your edge, and you have your like face. And one of the good things is that you can really like build these up, really work stuff over other things. What you want to do with these is not just work super hard. And everybody thinks, oh, you know, you're working with chalk pastels, you just blend them all together, and you can do that because obviously they're soft pastels, you can blend them very easily. And what you end up doing is just having a really muddy image where you don't have, you know, that sharpness, that cleanness of mark, that sort of the deliberateness of it. You know? And to be able to sort of put those planes together and try and bring out some things in here. I'm going to take a bit of orange. So you can work up in these colours. This is definitely a media where I'd say use a restricted palette, because if I just let myself use any of these colours, then I'm going to end up with a very confusing mess. One of the great things about chalk pastels is you have planes, and you can always break things up, break 3D shapes up into their planes. When you get to the end of a chalk painting, chalk drawing, what you're going to want is some hairspray, because right now that just goes everywhere. Hairspray is like glue. So just coming in and, you know, giving it a little bit of that fixative. You can dull down the colours. So, you know, work out the order that you're wanting to produce your image. Because, you know, if I was to do this, oh, that smell is so nostalgic. Wow. Hairspray, I could just sniff it all day. Here is a different type of chalk pastel. These ones are Conte à Paris. They're just great. They're a little bit stiffer, they're a little bit firmer than those soft pastels I was using. They're a little bit smaller. You have a little bit more precision. I've used these a huge amount. But again, you can just work from light to dark. You know, it's a lot more difficult to get kind of a lot of material out of it, which is a good thing. Definitely a good thing. If I remember correctly, they're about £8, £6, £7, £8 a pack, but they really last you. So as you can see, even with lots of pressure, I'm not getting a completely filled in mark as I would with one of the other soft pastels. And they're a lot easier if you're building up areas like this. You have a certain limitation. You're forced into creating areas of layered up tone. So if you were to do this, if you were to be working up a painting, you'd then be able to go in, once you've fixed it, once it's fixed once, you can then go back in, maybe like take your highlight colours back in there, maybe throw a little bit of white in, just touch it in. The great thing about these pastels is they pick up the other layers. Everything that you put down becomes a part of it. The next thing I want to talk about is oil pastels. They have a resistance, but as you can see, you can sort of put down some layer, and then if I was to come in with a blue, none of these are snapped. I don't know why none of them are snapped. Don't be afraid of breaking your pastels. You're almost never going to want a full-length pastel, because that's just too long. You know, it's fine to make it the length that you want it. As you can see, as I'm working over this, we're getting these little sort of completely opaque sections. It's not really picking up any new material. Whereas here where we've still got some grain, it is managing to. So one of the things that you can do, toothpick, you can draw in relief in them by scratching back some of that layer. And it will leave pigment underneath. Lots of these things they follow the same rule. You know, once you can draw, once you can paint, you can kind of paint with everything. Once you have your fundamentals of like proportion, or if you're into drawing people, then you know you've got your anatomy down. You sort of understand the basics of mixing colour. You can kind of do anything with anything. I know that probably sounds quite overly simplistic, but using oil pastels, all you need to know about oil pastels is that you can dissolve them in white spirit, the same as you can with oil paint. And chalk pastels, you know that you need to fix them after you've used them, and you can blend them. My personal opinion is avoid blending until you know when to use it. It's a layering game. You have to put colour on top of colour, on top of colour, on top of colour, until you end up with the right colour that you want. You're always going to want to put dark on top of light, rather than trying to work light on top of dark. You know, it's not really going to work so well. Let's get into watercolour a little bit. So I mentioned earlier that the watercolour pencils. So essentially what you can do is you can take a brush. This is a major brush and it is a size 10. I've sort of set this with saliva. Sounds kind of gross, but what you can do is when a paintbrush gets frayed, we have a brush that's just fraying over. It doesn't seem to be dropping bristle. Oh yes it does. But it's just pointing in all directions. So you can just wet it with some saliva, shape it how you want, and then leave that to dry, and that will hold its shape then. So what I want to show you is, the great thing about saliva is it's water soluble. You know, it will fix it, but it won't it won't make your bristles bunch. Just make sure that you wash your brush. Never ever leave a brush unwashed. So with watercolour and with acrylic paint and with gouache, it's water, and with oil paint, it's white spirit. This was the watercolour pencil here. So I'm just taking a wet brush, and as you can see, these pencils, they have some pigment that will come out in the water. So you can, really smooth these things out. Take away some of that pencil grain. So here it was just green and red, and that's, now just blended that down to a nice brown. It's a browny green. There was a whole lot more green pigment. What I would say, never ever dip your watercolour pencil in water. And also don't put a watercolour pencil over wet paper. It will ruin it. It will ruin your pencil. Because the nib is completely water soluble. So let's get into some actual watercolour. So both of these packs are the little tablets of watercolour. Some people like them, I like them, some people don't like them, that's fine. You can get the tubes, like the squeezy tubes, little squeezy tubes, squeeze a little bit out into a tray, but then they harden, you just wet them and they get movable again. This is what I'm talking about. You squeeze a bit of paint into each of these, and then you have your sort of space to mix it. And this one is my frequently used one. People complain that watercolours are very difficult to use. I would not agree with that statement. You just need to be able to let go of your control. With these little tablets, what you want to do is you want to activate them. Just going to put a little bit of water on a few of the ones that I want to use. And then just let that sit for just a second. You're using watercolours. You have a few different options. Either you can get an area of paper you've already wet. When you apply paint to it, it will bleed, and that's one of the beauties of watercolours is that you can do that. But also with a dry brush, you can also lift up colour. If you're building up an area, and with watercolours you do have to build up areas, you really have to let the watercolours just sort of sit and dry and then work on top of it again. So when you're doing watercolours, you need to make the decision whether or not you want this kind of hard edge or whether or not you want a soft gradient. Let's just talk a little bit about mixing watercolours. There's no black in my watercolour set. You don't need a black ever. You've always got to mix a colour. And basically what you're going to do, if you want to mix your dark, you take a dark blue, and then you want to take your dark brown, and they're both a similar value. So basically what happens when you mix them is your dark warm, your brown, cancels out your dark cold, which is your blue. And you need to balance that. So if you want it to be more on the warm side, then it needs to have more brown in it. If it wants to be more on the cold side, you want to have more of you want to have more blue in it. But again, as you can see here, unless I'm literally flooding my page, it's not really going to go down. What I need to do is build these up in layers. So some of this area here, some of this is dry now. So if I wanted to get that pinky orange as mixed, it's got a bit of green in it already, but in my opinion that just adds to the patina of the colour. So when you're working sort of this wet on dry, parts of it you can see aren't dry, so that's going to blend really nicely in the middle there, but we're still going to get some of our hard edges. So let's say that you didn't want a hard edge in a certain area. If you add just water, then that's going to allow that area to bleed up and form a nice little sort of natural gradient. If you were doing an ink drawing, these pens are waterproof. If you are working over something with water, make sure that you are using a waterproof ink. So essentially what you can do here is you can just create yourself a light wash. Most of watercolour painting is building up washes. What I'm doing now is fussing. You don't want to fuss, you don't want to try and push your watercolour into an area. If you start thinking that you are trying to move the watercolour artificially, it's time to stop, walk away. You need to not do that. Watercolour will do its own thing. The best thing you can do for it is to just let it have its space, let it do its thing, let it work out where it's going, and then dry. So this isn't dry, but I'm just going to touch a little bit around those lines, just sort of hint towards a bit of shadow in the cracks. So one of the great things about watercolour as well is that it can be re-wet, not just these, but when you have an area and if you've let something dry, you can re-wet it and allow it to move around a little bit again. And also it's important to note, this is a matte finish paint. You won't get a glossy sheen with watercolour. Let's have a look at some of these. So let's just touch on acrylic paint. You can use acrylic paint much the same way as you would use watercolour. So you can water these down. So you can use them for washes, or you can use them for splattering and drips, things like that, make them much thinner. Because, for most of these paints, they are quite thick, they're quite opaque. So you got a very opaque paint there. However, with water, that can be used for a wash, and then you choose how opaque that wash is. You can get acrylics in all sorts of different colours. This one is just aqua. This one has been, oh, what a great smell. If you really want to appreciate the media that you're working with, just give it a sniff. Give it a sniff just before you work. Just really get an appreciation for whatever it is that you're working with when you know what it smells like. So things like being able to show brush strokes, because it's a thick paint. It's now don't quote me on this, but I think it's a PVA base paint, so essentially a pigment in glue. So these paints are not expensive. I think these are about £6, £8 a tube. These ones are way less, because obviously they are thinner, smaller. These ones, these Winsor Newton, I feel like these ones are probably going to be quite expensive. You can tell from that richness. You can see when paint is good quality. I tried really hard to come up with some kind of illustration to show what media can go on what. There are so many different orders of things, and so many different ways of using a medium that I couldn't really create a linear list. I'm just going to play this video in the background. It's a little drawing I did showing a range of media and showing what can go on top of what. There are so many variables in deciding on layering media, and essentially you have to understand how a medium is applied, and how it binds to the page, and how that affects the next layer and how that binds. I'm just going to run through the media that are covered in this video, so starting with pencils. Pencils need a key. They're applied by abrasion, so they require a slightly rough surface like paper that has a texture to it. If you've really gone to town shading an area, essentially you're going to fill up the key of that surface, so you have less abrasive action available to the next media. If you shaded an area a lot, you would have difficulty applying colouring pencils or chalk or applying acrylic paint on top. You'll be able to put it on, but it would peel off. It wouldn't hold because there's no roughness for it to adhere to. Also, if you're using watercolour pencils, you have to be aware that if you put any wet medium on top, the pigment of the watercolour pencil will begin to bleed even if it's just using pens. So next of all is pens. With rollerballs, if they're the thicker ink, then again it requires some sort of rough surface to turn the ball. If you've ever tried drawing with a biro on a super smooth surface, you'll find you won't be able to because that ball won't turn, it'll just slide over the surface. The application relies on the ball rolling, similar to a paint roller pushing that ink out across the surface. Even if you shade with rollerballs, you really can't fill up the grain of the paper, so you're pretty well able to apply any other media on top of the rollerball as long as the ink is waterproof. However, you should definitely not put rollerballs on top of chalk pastel, because they will lift some of that powder from the surface and it gets inside the ball and it can gum up the pen and potentially ruin it. With fibre tip pens, it's dependent on whether or not you're using a waterproof ink or a water-based ink. They work because ink moves from the cartridge into the tip, fills the tip, and then the tip is applied to the paper and ink is drawn out. With felt tips, you're able to draw on most things. However, again, you're going to want to avoid chalk pastels and any kind of soft or wet surface. You would definitely have difficulty using a fine liner on top of acrylics. It is, however, okay to use fine liners beneath paint and chalk and oil pastels in all pencil marks. Similarly to pencils, chalk pastels rely on the key of the material that you're working to lift some of the material off the pastel. You would have difficulty putting this on top of a gloss finish paint, like a glossy acrylic or glossy oil. Chalks leave a dusty residue, and so you need to be careful what you're putting on top of it because it will prevent other materials from keying in. The same as you put flour on your rolling pin before rolling out pastry to prevent it from sticking, you would struggle to paint on top of chalk pastel. Oil pastels again require an abrasive key to lift material off the pastel. You can put them on top of most dry media, any matte media. Also, because the surface remains soft with oil pastels, you're not going to be able to use the pencil over the top. You're not going to be able to use most pens over the top. You're not going to be able to use watercolour over the top. You can actually use oil pastels to mask off areas to prevent water-based paints from sticking to them. If you mask off an area of a white page with white oil pastel, that area is not going to be affected by a wash going over it. So watercolour. Watercolour you can put on most surfaces. It doesn't require an abrasive surface. All that happens is the water evaporates and it leaves the pigment behind. The water is soaked in or absorbed and it draws the pigment into the fibres of the page. You need to be aware of putting it on top of pen and pencil. You have to make sure that those media are waterproof and they're not going to be affected. If you're unsure about something, try it on a test piece. Maybe have a piece of paper to one side that you can check things, check your colour mix, check media will layer correctly. Watercolour will lift the grain of the paper or board and actually make for a rougher surface, making it easier to use pencil or pastel on top. Getting into acrylic now. Acrylic binds to the page or canvas or board mechanically. It's essentially glue. PVA-based glues work by going into the cracks and undulations of the materials they're on, and then when the water evaporates it dries, mechanically binding to the surface. So you require a surface that has a key for acrylic paint to stick to. Things like oil pastel and chalk pastel and oil paint will prevent acrylic from properly adhering to the surface. Finally, oil paints. I know I didn't show them, but this is very important to note. Oil paint can go on top of acrylic when it's dry, but acrylic cannot go on top of oil paint. There are a lot of people with that question, and that's basically the answer. Acrylic will peel when painted over oil paints, whereas the opposite is not true, as long as the acrylic is dried properly. I'm sorry this video ended up as long as it did. I'm going to touch on a few of the topics I've omitted in the future. I ignored the digital side. I'm going to make specific videos for those. I just realised they were way too big for including in this, and I'm also going to have a video soon on making my own sketchbook, so that's why I didn't talk about paper, as I'm going to include it in that. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope it's been helpful and maybe you've been exposed to some media that you haven't seen before. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment and hit that subscribe button, and as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day.